Welcome back. So the 2019 appropriation bill was on May 27th, signed into law by President Muhammadu Buhari, but the exercise did not end without the president expressing his concerns over the changes he said the National Assembly introduced. And so he said the budget increase from 8.83 trillion naira to 8.91 trillion naira will adversely impact his government's programs. And the National Assembly leadership have said, we just did, performed our constitutional role. And so we are going to be looking this morning, at how this budget can work better for Nigerians, how we can ensure that economically everything will go well, and in terms of, appropriating particular monies to different sectors of the economy. We have in the studio this morning a partner, Stairs. Okay, Stairs Business or Stairs?
Stairs is
okay, fine. Michael Famoroti is in the house, is an economist, and of course the chairman, Chartered Institute of Bankers, Professor Uwaleke in our Abuja studios. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning.
Okay, so let me start with you in Abuja. The 2019 budget, we have seen it. We've seen the increase and we've heard the concerns that the president raised. Should the president be concerned in any way?
Well, let me start by noting that, of course, as you know, the size of the 2019 budget is smaller than what we had in 2018. In 2018, we voted to spend 9.12 trillion naira. And in 2019, the president sent in 8.8, and the National Assembly increased it by 90 billion naira. So what we have now is about 8.91 trillion naira, which is less than what we had last year. And, the justification for that is the fact that the government is beginning to be conscious of the fact that we are, borrowing too much, and the burden is beginning to weigh on the economy, especially with respect to the debt service to revenue ratio. And in order not to increase the budget deficit, we needed to trim down. And that's why you find those parameters, that were used. Recall that the budget is based on $60 per barrel expectation, average for the year, 2.3 million barrels per day output, and exchange rate of 305 naira to the dollar. And people have raised concerns about the realism of this assumptions. In my view, to a large extent, yes, those are things we could achieve, except perhaps for the output level of 2.3 million that looks a little on the high side, considering that in recent times we've not done close to $2 million per barrel. So on the whole, I would say yes, the president is concerned because he thinks that those increases, because not just the increase, because he said some items were removed from certain projects and then moved to some others. He has reason to be concerned. But these things will need to be sorted out, by, I keep saying it, by a budget law that will clearly spell out whether the National Assembly has rights to increase the size of the envelope. Yes, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, Section 11 to be precise, gives the National Assembly the power to, to receive the appropriation bill and make amendments, where necessary. But it didn't say whether the modifications, yes, that's the word that was used there, modifications included raising the size of the budget. So that's why the president is concerned. And I'm happy that, of course, he went ahead to sign the appropriation bill, regardless of that, because that was what delayed, if you recall, the 2018 appropriation bill. The bill was sent into the National Assembly in November 7 to be precise. But the budget didn't really get out till somewhere, I think sometime in June 6, on June 6th. Now, this time around, the president sent in the appropriation bill on the 19th of December, and by May, we already having it out. So you could say, in terms of speed, we had a little slight improvement, from what we had the last time. But of course, the budget is merely an instrument for allocating resources. It's a policy document, and what's important is not just in having the policy out, but more importantly, it's in the implementation. If you look at the budget implementation report so far released, the latest you have on the website of the Budget Office is that of the third quarter of 2018. It says a lot. It says that implementation, fell short of targets, for obvious reasons. The first, of course, happens to be the delay in the passage.
Kindly hold your thought for a moment. Before we go deeper into that, let's move away a bit from the injections into the budget that the president has expressed reservations with, and let's go into the character of the budget. It appears that in Nigeria, pre-budgeting season, we talk about things we want to see in the budget because we want to see a different country. You talk about things like infrastructure. You talk about things like diversifying the economy. You talk about the need to budget more for education. But you realize that time and time again, you don't see these changes. And these are the things that spur national prosperity. Tell me, if you compare budgets year after year, you see that based on allocations to certain things, it appears that we may not have made a character change from our budgetary thinking because of the kind of country that we want to see. What's responsible for this?
I actually tend to agree with you to a large part, and I use health and education because we have AU rules that indicate how much we should be dedicating to those sectors, and Nigeria generally doesn't dedicate enough. So I think education is something like 5 to 10%, and we don't do anything near that. So I definitely agree with you that there has not been enough of a change in the character of the budget. The one thing that has been a bit different in the last 4 years, though, is an emphasis on capital expenditure. So, for example, in 2015, the budget was revised downwards, and the capital expenditure portion was just about 500 billion. This year, the capex is about 2 trillion. So you can see that in that area, at least on paper, there has been a focus on infrastructure. The unfortunate thing is I don't think the reality has matched as well. And I think part of that is because capex is very opaque, right? It covers a lot of things. It goes from roads and airports to things like buying cars and computers and buildings for admin departments of civil service workers. So it's difficult, even with the reports that they put out, to gauge the extent to which the money they spend on capex is actually effective and is actually going to improve our infrastructure. And of course, the final challenge there is that there's a time lag, right? So if I dedicate 200 billion naira to roads, it takes time before the effects of those roads begin to show, right? You tar the road, you commission the road, then people start driving, and then things start to change. So it's difficult to judge how effective that change has been, but I will be clear that I think it has been a positive change because, like my colleague said, we have tended to spend a lot more on personnel costs and debt servicing. And the reality is that that's spending for today. And what will change the country is spending for tomorrow, which we're still not doing enough of.
Yeah, so if we look at a bit of highlights of this budget, we'll see that capital expenditure is at 2.09 trillion. Recurrent expenditure, 4.07, and that's speaking to what you're talking about in statutory transfers of 502 billion, fiscal deficit of 1.92 trillion, and special intervention fund of 500 billion. So this is what we have now, and we're also talking about the start of this budget. We are signing the budget at the end of May, and so implementation. Let's talk about implementing this budget. How effective do you think it will be?
Yeah, so
considering what happened last year.
Yeah, exactly. The positive is that we've been here before. We were here in 2016. In fact, the post-2014, the budget has always been passed in the second quarter of the year. So we are used to it. In fact, our new cycle is now, May, June. Right?
Yeah.
Really, right? There's no point wasting our time saying we're doing a January to December cycle. So we know how things tend to pan out, and it varies by the line item, right? So the trend for capital expenditure is that because it takes time for this money to be disbursed, the Minister of Finance must sign off. It must then go to different bodies like the Transport Ministry and so on. You find that when the budget is passed in May, June, the first set of capex releases come out in, say, September. So for that year, the first time the Transport Ministry or the power sector is getting capex is in September, right? And then it spills into the next year, right? So right now we're still seeing money from the 2018 capital expenditure budget being used, right? Because of how late it was, right? So the reality is that 2 trillion naira that is budgeted for capex this year, most of it is going to be spent in 2020 because of how late the budget has been passed.
How is this affecting, the economy itself? If you have a budget of, last year, 2018, we're still talking about, some of the money is still being spent now, and what is being appropriated now is some of them will spill over to 2020.
Yeah, for me, the real effect is in terms of monitoring, right? When you operate a January to December cycle, and on the first day of the new year, okay, I've closed off that budget, it's a lot easier to monitor funds than when you're effectively running 2 budgets concurrently, right? Because a couple of weeks or months ago, the budget office still sent a circular to the ministries telling them that, still keep on spending your 2018 capex, right? So it gives room for confusion, and then it makes it difficult to track, because when you see the reports that they put out saying that in 2017 they spent 2 trillion naira on capex, you don't know, okay, was this part of the 2016 budget? Was it 2017 budget? Where did that money come from? And I think for 2017, they actually had to clarify that, this portion was from the 2016 budget and this was from the 2017 budget, right? So it makes it difficult for us to track what's going on and how the funds are being spent, right? And I think there's a very big contrast, because when you look at personnel costs and debt servicing, that spending goes on throughout the year, right? So once the budget is passed, salaries start being paid, right? Debts starts being paid, right? So essentially what you have is, by the end of December, we've only spent maybe 500 billion of capex, but we've spent a lot more on our debt servicing and on paying salaries, right? So, for example, in 2018, capex performance so far was less than 50%, right? Personnel costs are looking like 90-something%, debt service is looking at 90-something% as well. So again, even when you shift from paper to what goes on in real life, there's a huge gap between what we're spending on capital expenditure and what we're spending on salaries and debts, which again, that is money for today. That ultimately doesn't really add much value in the long run.
Okay, let me go to Abuja. You've mentioned the fact that, yes, there are some concerns with some of the benchmarks that the government puts in terms of achieving this budget. Crude oil, say, expected $60, and it's hovering around 60-something now. And some people have said, if anything goes wrong and these prices would drop, then there is an issue with our budget and how we are going to achieve it.
Yes, I agree with you. But if you, there's no doubt that the oil market is highly volatile. But if you look at, our story in the last few years, the oil price benchmark hasn't been the issue. In 2016, for example, even in the middle of the recession, oil price averaged about $40, $45 per barrel. In 2017, we also had an average oil price that was higher than the budget reference price. In 2017, the budget reference price was $44.5 per barrel. And in 2018, we can also say the same thing. The reference price was $51 per barrel. And we also had an oil price that averaged, much more than that. The challenge, has always been the output, which is why, I'm happy that the restiveness in the Niger Delta, the cases of pipeline vandalism and, shut-ins, have reduced, drastically. So it hasn't been with oil price. And from all indications, from forecasts that we have from reputable energy agencies such as the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and from even the futures market, price in the futures market, the indication is that for this year, oil price will also average something higher than $60 per barrel. Because if somebody is saying, a consumer is saying, for example, deliver some barrels of oil in 3 months' time at, say, $70 per barrel, agreed today, that's the futures price, it tells you that the oil price promises to be above, at least stay above $60 per barrel, for this year. So for me, I think to a large extent is realistic. As I mentioned earlier, the challenge has always come in from the output angle. You recall too that if you look at the GDP report by the National Bureau of Statistics for Q1 of 2018, it made it clear there that GDP dropped from 2.38% in the last quarter of 2018 to 1% in the first quarter of 2019 on account of a fall in oil production from 1.98 barrels per day to 1.96 barrels per day. So that is where, the challenge, has always come. Talking about the exchange rate, of course, it makes a lot of sense to use the official exchange rate of 305 naira, to the dollar. We couldn't be using something. If you use something higher than 305 naira to the dollar, say, some say, why not use 360 since that's the interbank rate? But if you did that, of course, you would be signaling that the government intends to devalue the currency, and that will cause a lot of distortions, in the economy. So I think the parameters used in the budget, including the inflation target as well as the GDP growth rate. Is the GDP growth rate that we see as a little ambitious, 3.01%, when the World Bank and IMF are forecasting 2%, 2.1%, and the central bank recently also made a forecast of 2.3. So 3.01 could be on the high side. But having said that, I want to speak to this issue of implementation. Again, if you look at budget implementation reports, quarterly reports by the budget office, it's also clear that the suboptimal performance of our budget can be blamed squarely. Yes, we know it's a function of revenue, but you can also blame that on the fact that our budgets have not been coming out in good time. Take the case of capital spending, for example. Even when you roll over, what that does is that it effectively halts the implementation of the capital component of the budget for the current year. So when budgets don't come out in time, automatically they become, in terms of implementation, if you could say, dead on arrival. And when you add that to the lengthy procurement process, and you also add that to the delays in sometimes procuring external loans, because this budget is based on, is going to be financed partly by external loans, and they are not as easy to come by as your domestic loans. So if you factor in the delays in getting external loans, sometimes even the approval from the National Assembly, you factor in the lengthy procurement process, you factor in even the rising non-discretionary spending by the government. Personnel costs are rising. And some of these things, when money is not made available to finance a contract, for example.
All right,
Okay,
Professor Uwaleke, I'm sorry to butt in again. We need to take a break now. We'll continue right after now. Join us again. You're watching Sunrise from the headquarters of Channels Television, and we're discussing the 2019 budget and matters arising from that. We have in the studio with us Mr. Michael Famoroti, partner, Steers, and Mr. Uche, Professor Uche Uwaleke. And they've been bouncing figures around, but I want Mr. Famoroti to respond to this. We keep basing budget performance and spending on something we don't have control over, which is the oil price. You see, other countries play to their strengths. We see Dubai decided to leave the oil market, and they said, look, we're staying with what we have, which is tourism. Now, Nigeria has comparative advantage in the area of agriculture. We are the largest producer of yams in the world, and most of our cash crops are the best. They've proven to be the best in the world. Any country will play to that strength. Why are we not doing this? We're basing this year's budget again on something we don't have control over. I don't think a country like United States will do that. They would try to play in the area of their strength. How can we change this such that we can see more prosperity?
Yeah, I think the challenge with that is we may have known what our strengths were in 1970. I don't think we know what our strengths are now in terms of what crops to produce, right? So a lot of times we talk about our natural advantages in producing, yam and rice. We say we have lots of fertile land, arable land.
Yeah.
All these things are valid and fine, but the reality of farming in the 21st century is that you find that there are places in the world that 20 years ago you would not have imagined crops being produced there, but the technology has permitted them to be competitive. And you find that when Nigerian farmers try to export their products, the standards don't meet up, right? So yes, I agree that we have natural comparative advantage, but the government needs to pay a lot more attention to figuring out what exactly it is in, because it's not agriculture, not anymore, right? It can be specific crops, but it is not rice because we want to produce rice. If we take in that perspective of we believe we can produce rice better than anyone else, so we are going to do it, you have this situation of the lake rice, where it was a vanity project that ultimately did not work out as as they expected, right? So yes, I'm all for finding your advantages, right? But it does not actually, I'm pretty sure it's not going to be what it was in 1970, right? You have to figure out in the modern economy, what can I produce? Maybe it's fintech, maybe it's tourism. It does not have to be yams or rice, right? We need to divorce ourselves from that, going back to the old days and try and look forward to the better days to come, right? Just a caveat on the oil price, because I tend to disagree with my colleague in Abuja, and I agree that the oil price has generally been above the budget benchmark. But the idea of the benchmark is it's an emergency benchmark, right? So the day the oil price, or the year the oil price crashes, you want to ensure that your benchmark can absorb it. For the last 3 years, we have not done that. We have been fortunate that the oil price has always been higher, but our system of determining the price is still flawed. You go back to 2015, and they kept on revising the price downwards because they were stubborn. They came in with this perspective again of, oh, as long as the price is above the benchmark, we're fine. The problem was the price suddenly started crashing and your benchmark could not absorb it, right? So it is not about trying to figure out a price that is below the benchmark. It is figuring out a price that allows you absorb any significant volatility in all prices. And for me, $60 in a year when I would expect the average to be around 65, 70, it's cutting it too close. That's just my own perspective on the oil price.
Please let me go to Professor Uwaleke. Help us find some link with these two parameters, if there is any. People are expected to work. We need to have productivity. And we see that in the last few years, there's brain drain in Nigeria. There's massive exodus. Those who we expect that will put in this much work, this much productivity, are leaving the country and they're finding fine jobs abroad. Case in point, Canada. Can you help us find a link, if there is or if there are, between the brain drain that we're experiencing in the country and being able to plateau or even take a flight in terms of productivity?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just before I speak to that, permit me to quickly profile a solution. You see, I've talked about the challenges to implementing the budget. The major challenge I identified as, this late passage of the budget. For me, one of the things that we can do to solve that challenge or address that challenge is getting out an organic law. I'm not too happy that the 8th National Assembly didn't really complete that process, because I'm aware the National Assembly started that process. Having an organic law similar to the U.S. Congressional Law of 1974, that spells out clearly the timetable for the various stages of the budget process. There are 4 budget stages. You have the formulation, the approval, the implementation, and the control. So the organic law will spell out, clear timetables, for this. And it's also important that we amend as quickly as we can the broken, budget cycle, because we can't afford to have a cycle that runs from July, through June, given the weather situation, in this country. We had that in the past. Recall that in the past our cycle was April through March, but we had to change that because of our type of climate we have in Nigeria, as opposed to what obtains in the UK. UK still runs April, through March. So we need to align it in line with the section 318 of the Constitution, which says fiscal year has to run from January, to December. So having said that, I also want to say that because you talked about the impact of this delay, and part of what it has done is that, of course, you don't expect investors to come in when there is still there is still no clarity about your policy space. So one thing a budget does is to provide that clarity, and once the budget is out, you find it triggers a whole lot of activities in the economy. The government's expenditure represents about 10% of aggregate expenditure, but yet it is what triggers every other spending you find in the economy, whether for private consumption or expenditure by firms. Now, talking about the brain drain, one of the things, of course, we can do to address the issue of the brain drain is to invest in education. If you look at the education budget for this year, the capital component is just 47 billion. 2018, it was around 100 billion. Human capital development in general, health, for example, too, shrank to about 50 billion capital component in 2019, from about something billion in 2018. So you have seen a reduction in investment in education. But I also think that is not something the government alone can do. The private sector should also come in, and which is why I always advocate that if we must address the brain drain, if we must address the skills level, because it's also about productivity, it's about skills level. Okay, if you must address that, we should go back to recommendations already made. You have the needs assessment by universities. You also have the National Policy on Education, the 6th edition. One of the things is said there in the National Policy on Education is that the funding of education should not be left for the government alone, that even the private sector can also contribute. And to that, it's recommended that at least 1.5% of all contractors, consultants' fee should go into a special fund called Corporate Social Responsibility Fund to fund education. Because apart from, if you remove the intervention funds we have today, if you remove Uwaleke, you remove TED Fund, the story of education in Nigeria would be a very sorry state. So education is not something we can fund from annual budgetary appropriations. It will never be adequate, okay? Especially when you talk about the percentages that we hear, 26%, UNESCO, even though some still argue that, there's nothing like that. But
okay, Professor Uwaleke, let me come back to the studio here. The federal government has said that they're thinking of borrowing 90 billion naira to, this addition to the budget. Do you think this is a wise decision?
So that 90 billion naira, is it in respect to the money that the National Assembly added?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's a very simple thing, right? Because I think there's a bit of point scoring going on here. My colleague in the studio mentioned that last year we had a similar story, and I think the numbers were even larger last year. I know it was quite significant, right? 90 billion is about 1% of an 8.9 trillion naira budget. At the same time, we are not going to spend 8.9 trillion naira. We never spend the entire budget, right? I think 2018, we don't have the full year reports, but so far, I think if you prorate it, it comes to about 70%. 2017 is between 70 to 80%, right? So whether the nominal budget is 8.5 trillion or 8.9 trillion, we aren't going to spend 8 point anything trillion, right? That's just something to get very clear, mainly because we do not have the funding to get to 8.9 trillion, right? The FG budget revenue isn't going to touch 5 trillion, right? That money is not going to come from anywhere. Just looking at the previous trend, looking at oil price and tax revenue, they are not going to earn more than 5 trillion from anywhere, right? The rest is going to be borrowed. So what is more important to me than the headline number being 9 trillion or 8 trillion is, one, the breakdown. And because of the new minimum wage, we're seeing a lot more personnel costs. Because we've been borrowing a lot previously, we now have a lot more interest payments. So you find that the capital expenditure portion has been slashed a lot from 2018 to 2019. So that is what has taken the hits, right? So it's very easy for us to focus on the headline budget, which is fine, but actually what took the hit this year was capital expenditure, which is spending for the future, right? So that's a key thing. Generally, in terms of debt, I am personally quite worried about sort of the next 10 years. I do think that our debt profile is manageable, but what we have a problem with is our revenues are not rising fast enough. So we're spending a lot of money on interest payments. Between 2016 and 2018, for every naira the government earned, it spent about 60 kobo just paying down debt. That is, by any account, an unsustainable lifestyle. Now, the more you borrow, the more that debt pile goes up, right? So for me, there's a lot of emphasis on making sure that your revenues rise so you are able to pay off your old debt and stop borrowing, right? Because a lot of times the Minister of Finance will point out that our debt to GDP ratio is about 20%. That's fine. Japan's is about 120%. So we are fine. The problem is we're spending all we're earning paying down that little 20% of debt.
We need to fix that.
Yeah.
I'm not an economist, but help me understand. If we want to focus on that problem that you have highlighted, it means that we need to increase productivity to be able to to be able to earn more. What do we need to focus on, apart from borrowing money, to ensure that we increase our revenue, especially locally?
Yeah, so I think that is a more general question that I really focus on, that really comes down to how do you make this economy grow faster?
Yeah.
And for me, there are quick wins that you can do, right? And sort of the first revolve around price regulation, right? Competitive markets tend to grow faster, right? When you have a market where the exchange rates are fixed to some extent, when fuel prices are fixed, when the prices of power is fixed, when the price of a lot of things are fixed, you stifle investment, right? I don't want to come into an industry where I know the government can tomorrow decide, oh, from today you cannot charge more than this. Right? But for the power sector to grow, which I think was being discussed previously, you need investment to come in. Right? But for investment to come in, you need to make it attractive, right? No one is going to come into the power sector knowing that tariffs are fixed and customers aren't even paying the tariffs anyway. It is a very unattractive sector, right? Right from the discos to the gencos, right? So once you begin to loosen all this price regulation, then at least you can attract capital to help you grow. But beyond productivity, right, one thing that the government has tried to do but hasn't been successful at is increase non-oil revenues, right, especially taxes. Our tax to GDP ratio is about 4 to 5%. That is one of the lowest in the world, right?
Sorry, did you say increase taxes?
Yeah.
And I'm sure some people are listening now and saying, which part of this man can I hold? Because as it is, the taxes, okay, so should we increase taxes or widen the tax net? Just so those that are not paying now can, be brought into the net and ensure that, you pay your tax.
Yeah, because we did a lot of that in the last 4 years. I mean, widening the tax and get more tax in.
The main thing is to increase tax revenue, right? For Nigeria, the emphasis now should actually be increasing the tax net, particularly on the income tax front, right? So it's stats from a couple of years back that there's only one person outside Lagos paying more than 20 million naira in tax. Now that is hilarious because 20 million naira in tax for many people in this country is nothing, right? So we need to capture more people. We tried it with the VADES program, but for lack of a better phrase, that just died, right? The target was about 300 billion and they raised about 30 billion, right? And they added I think 1 million or so taxpayers. So we need to increase the tax base, definitely. But the reality is, going further down the line, we also need to look at our tax rates and our tax systems, which are grossly inefficient, right? So you look at VAT and it's so confusing. There are so many exemptions. First of all, it's too low. It's at 5%. And then even that 5%, there's so many exemptions such that some people are paying a lot of VAT and then a lot of people are not paying any VAT, and it doesn't make sense.
And those that are paying are also worried about where the money is going.
Precisely.
Yeah. So if we want to widen the tax net, we also must be able to show the people, okay, the ones that we've collected, this is what we've used it for. Quickly, we'll go to Abuja because we're going to round this off.
If you allow me to ask him, okay. There's this initiative, Professor, that's the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council. And from the name, the assignment was clear, and they've done quite a lot of work. How would you assess the work of that council in contributing to the economy?
Yes, I think the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council has done a lot in improving the business climate. Again, if you look at an independent assessment of what they have done, you can find out in the World Bank Ease of Doing Business ranking. In 2016, this country was 169 out of 190 countries. By 2018, 2017, we were 24 places up. We were 145. on that ladder. So that tells you that a lot of work has been done. And if you take the 10 pillars of ease of doing business, whether registration of property, whether construction, ease of getting construction permit, access to credit, access to electricity, ease of paying taxes, resolving insolvency, trading across borders. If you take all of them, you will agree with me that considerable work, has been done.
All right.
And if you look at the last ranking, where Nigeria was placed 146, you will also discover that we made appreciable improvements in 5 of those.
Okay, thank you so much.
pillars.
Thank you so much, Professor Uwaleke, the Chairman, Chartered Institute of Bankers. And I'm looking forward to when exactly Nigeria will move, the budget cycle will move to January and December. Again, thank you for sharing your thoughts. And we have also in the studio here an economist and partner, Stairs, Michael Famoroti. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Pleasure as always.
Okay, we'll go on another quick break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about the flood.
Oh, the flood?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.